Good evening. Welcome to Nightfall Mirror. Tonight, I have 3 true stories. Stories that happen to real people, in real places, here in America. They are tales of the unexpected, moments when the ordinary veil of reality ripped, revealing something far more unsettling beneath. Our first story takes us to the vast, lonely highways of California in the early 90s, where a traveling salesman encounters a specter from his past. The second plunges us into the fading world of a small-town phone operator in 1968, connecting to a voice from beyond. And finally, we'll return to a family home in Virginia in 1994, where a daughter uncovers a legacy far darker than she could ever imagine. These aren't stories for the faint of heart. They are for those who appreciate the true, lingering chill of psychological horror. Let us begin. Our first account begins in November of 1991, on a notoriously isolated stretch of Highway 99 in California's Central Valley. Robert Maxwell was a traveling salesman, or road warrior, as he called himself. At 48 years old, he'd spent half his life crisscrossing the country, pushing everything from agricultural equipment to office supplies. This particular week, he was peddling industrial cleaning solutions. Robert drove a sturdy, if unremarkable, 1991 Buick LeSabre. His constant companions were his favorite cassette tapes and the ever-present loneliness of the road. On this particular morning, a thick Thule fog had rolled in, blanketing the landscape in a suffocating white shroud. Robert had learned to respect the Thule fog. It could make even familiar roads treacherous. He'd left Fresno before dawn, heading north towards Stockton. The only sound in his car was the tinny replay of Creedence Clearwater Revival. He'd been driving for a good 2 hours when, through a momentary thinning of the fog, he saw him. A man on the shoulder, thumb out, silhouetted against the swirling mist. It was a rare sight, even in 91. Most folks had cars, or at least a way to call. But something about the man, standing so still, pulled at Robert. He slowed, then pulled over. The hitchhiker climbed in, shaking off the dampness of the fog. He looked to be in his early 20s, dressed in a faded denim jacket and old canvas trousers, clothing that felt a little dated, even for 1991. But it was his face that hit Robert like a punch to the gut. The man was the spitting image of Robert's younger brother, Jimmy. Jimmy, who had died in Vietnam in 1968. "Thanks, mister," the young man said, his voice surprisingly deep. "Just need a ride a ways up the road." Robert, still reeling, managed to ask, "Where you headed?" "Just away from here," the hitchhiker replied, staring out at the fog. The conversation was sparse at first, as most such encounters are. Robert offered him a soda from his cooler. The young man politely declined, and Robert noticed a faint, almost medicinal scent emanating from him, something like jungle juice, the insect repellent his brother had used in the service. Then, the hitchhiker began to hum. It was a familiar tune, a nonsense song Robert and Jimmy had made up as children, a secret melody only they knew. Robert's blood ran cold. How could this stranger know that song? The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter. But why was this happening? Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. He tried to speak, but no words came. The young man, this impossible reflection of his dead brother, simply turned to him, his eyes holding an ancient sadness. "Pull over, Robert," he said, his voice soft, yet firm. "Just up here. Take a break. Have a smoke." Robert hadn't smoked in 15 years, but the command was absolute. He found himself signaling, pulling the LeSabre to the narrow shoulder of the highway, just as the fog seemed to grow impossibly thicker ahead. He killed the engine, the sudden silence inside the car deafening after the hum of the road. He was about to ask the impossible question, to demand an explanation, when it happened. From the impenetrable white wall ahead, a sound erupted. The screech of tires, metal twisting, a cacophony of shattering glass and desperate shouts. It was the unmistakable sound of a massive multi-car pile-up, mere yards beyond where they had stopped. Robert sat frozen, his hands still clutching the steering wheel. He turned, his breath catching in his throat, to thank the man, to ask him how. But the passenger seat was empty. No trace of the hitchhiker. Only a faint, lingering scent of insect repellent. Robert looked down. On the worn fabric of the seat, glinting dully in the dim light, lay a silver dog tag. It read, Maxwell, James D., U.S. Army. Oh, Pos, Robert never picked up another hitchhiker. That was the first story. The second is even more unsettling, taking us back to a time when human hands connected every phone call. Our next story unfolds in 1968, in the unassuming town of Willow Creek, Ohio. It was a pivotal year for the country, a year of social upheaval and technological change. For Mary Reynolds, 57 years old, it was the year her 30-year career as a manual switchboard operator was coming to an end. The telephone exchange, a small, brick building on Main Street, was slated to go fully automated by the end of the month. Mary, along with the few remaining operators, was tasked with guiding the final connections, preparing the town for a world where human voices no longer bridged the gap between callers. She knew every voice in Willow Creek, every rumor, every late-night emergency. The switchboard, a gleaming behemoth of wood, brass, and thousands of jacks, was her world. The air in the exchange always smelled faintly of ozone and old coffee. Mary loved the rhythmic clicking of the plugs, the subtle hum of electricity. It was a dying art, and she was one of its last practitioners. On her final night shift, a Tuesday, with only 2 other operators on duty in the vast, quiet room, a line lit up that shouldn't have. It was from the Evergreen Exchange, a prefix that had been decommissioned for 20 years, ever since the old rural lines were rerouted. Mary stared at it, a tiny red light glowing defiantly in a sea of dark, dead connections. She took a deep breath and plugged in. Willow Creek operator, how may I direct your call? Mary's voice, though seasoned, held a slight tremor. Static crackled, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Then, a child's voice, faint and distorted, barely audible beneath the hiss. Mommy? Is that you, Mommy? Mary's blood ran cold. The voice, thin and reedy, held an echo of something deeply familiar. Who is this, dear? She asked, her professionalism battling a rising tide of unease. Billy, the voice whispered. Billy Gable. Mary nearly dropped the plug. Billy Gable. The name hit her like a physical blow. Billy Gable was a local tragedy from her own childhood in 1948. A 4-year-old boy who had fallen into the old town well behind the mill and drowned. The search had been fruitless, his body never recovered. The Gables had moved away soon after, the grief too much to bear. Mary tried to trace the call, her fingers flying over the antiquated circuits. But the plug led to a dead-end jack, one that hadn't been connected to anything in decades. It was a ghost line, coming from nowhere. Her colleagues, engrossed in their own dwindling calls, hadn't noticed. But Mary heard it. The faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip beneath Billy's voice. The sound of water. What she found next changed everything. It's cold, Mommy, Billy's voice whimpered, growing fainter. So cold and dark. Mary's heart ached. She tried to tell him she wasn't his mother, but the words caught in her throat. She found herself trying to soothe him, as she would any distressed caller. Hold on, Billy, just hold on. Then, another voice, louder now, cutting through the static. A woman's voice, filled with a frantic, guttural relief. Billy! My baby! I'm coming! Mary recognized that voice too. It was Mrs. Gable, Billy's mother. But Mrs. Gable had died in 1955, a broken woman, never recovering from her son's disappearance. Mary heard a splash, a muffled cry, and then silence. The red light on the switchboard flickered once, then died, leaving the exchange in its intended quiet. Mary sat there, trembling, the plug still in her hand. The next morning, driven by a deep, inexplicable compulsion, Mary drove her 1962 Chevrolet Bel Air out to the old mill property, to the site of the forgotten well. It was overgrown with weeds, the stone rim crumbling, but it was there. She peered into the darkness, a shiver running down her spine. And there, partially submerged in the stagnant water at the bottom, glinting faintly, was a corroded, antique telephone handset. Its cord was severed, but the handset itself was unmistakably from the 1940s. As the police later discovered, the handset was still warm to the touch. The final story tonight took place just a few decades ago, and it reminds us that sometimes, the deepest horrors lie buried not in forgotten places, but within the very foundations of our own homes. Our final tale brings us to Richmond, Virginia, in the year 1994. Martha Jenkins, a recently retired schoolteacher at 61 years old, had returned to her childhood home to settle the estate of her late father. The old colonial-style house on Sycamore Street was filled with a lifetime of memories and a lifetime of clutter. Her father, a quiet man who had worked as a county clerk, had passed peacefully in his sleep, leaving Martha with the bittersweet task of sifting through decades of accumulated history. Martha had always loved the house. It was a sturdy, old place, built in the 1920s, filled with the comforting scent of dust and old books. Her current task involved the basement, a damp, unfinished space where her father had stored everything from old tools to boxes of 1950s vinyl records. As she sorted through a box marked Dad's old files, filled with faded tax forms and utility bills, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic behind the old coal chute. The coal chute, long since out of use, was usually sealed tight. But as Martha pushed aside a stack of ancient newspapers, she saw it. Not just the chute, but a small, expertly hidden wooden door set into the wall behind it. A door that wasn't on the house's original blueprints, and a door she had never known existed. Her father had been a man of routines and open books. This secret, hidden behind the very place where the family's heating fuel had been delivered, was utterly out of character. The normal had become profoundly abnormal. Martha's heart pounded. With a creak of old wood, she pulled the hidden door open. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, but it was unmistakably a living space. There was a rusted cot, a tiny, rickety table, and a stack of 1960s magazines. It smelled stale, like disuse and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. On the table, carefully placed, was a faded photograph of a young girl, no older than 10, smiling shyly. And next to it, a small, silver locket. Martha's hands trembled as she picked it up. She recognized the locket. It was identical to one worn by Sarah Peterson, a local girl who had vanished without a trace in 1962. The town had searched for weeks, but Sarah was never found. Martha, herself a teenager then, remembered the fear that had gripped Richmond. As she stared at the locket, a chilling thought crawled into her mind. The room hadn't just been lived in. It had been lived in recently. A water glass on the table had condensation rings still visible. A newspaper from last week lay half-read on the cot. Suddenly, a faint, rhythmic click broke the silence. The sound of a rotary phone dialing. It was coming from the room. Martha froze, her blood turning to ice. The phone, an antique black model, sat on a dusty shelf in the corner. As she watched, transfixed, the dial slowly, deliberately, turned back to its resting position. A number had been dialed. Then, she noticed something else. A small, perfectly circular hole drilled into the wall, covered by a crude wooden flap. It opened directly into the kitchen, looking out onto the sink in the main window. Someone had been watching. And in that moment, Martha realized the true horror of the room. Her father wasn't just hiding a room. He had been keeping someone. Or something. And whatever it was still here. The implications crashed over Martha like a cold wave. Her father, the quiet, dependable county clerk, had kept a secret, a person, trapped in his basement for decades. And the rotary phone, dialing itself, watching her from its dark perch. She stumbled backward out of the hidden room, scrambling to close the door, to seal the horror away. But as her hand reached for the latch, a sound echoed from the other end of the basement. A soft, deliberate creak. The cellar door, which had been securely bolted from the inside, slowly, silently, swung open. A sliver of inky blackness, deeper than any shadow, appeared in the crack. Martha did not wait. She ran. She fled the house that night, never to return. The police investigation found no trace of Sarah Peterson, nor any evidence of recent habitation in the hidden room, beyond the locket and the faded magazines. The old rotary phone was found shattered on the floor. But Martha knew what she had seen. And she often wondered, as the years passed, if her father had truly been the keeper, or if he had merely been another victim, watching in terror from his own dark corner, until whatever was truly in that room decided to make a call. 3 stories. 3 instances where the ordinary bled into the truly terrifying. Have you, or someone you know, ever experienced anything like this? A brush with the inexplicable, a whisper from the past, or a secret hidden in plain sight? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for joining me tonight on Nightfall Mirror. If these stories chilled you, please consider subscribing for more true horror. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, some things are better left undisturbed. Good night.